So for the past few weeks, we have been, in this whole series, we've been talking about the schools, the different schools of a young Jewish person, right? And maybe to the point where you're just like, I've heard about these schools so many times, that first school of Bet 6-year-old, 10 years old. And if you're good, but not great, they say, go learn the trade of your father. And if you're the best of the best, you can move on to the next school, Bet Talmud, and from 10 to 15, learn the whole Bible, whole thing memorized. And if you're good but not great, they would say, okay, go learn the trade of your father. But if you're the best of the best of the best, you would find what? You go into Bet Midrash. I've been repeating that story so many times, virtually every week for the last 5 weeks, because of for many reasons, but this one reason. I think it's remarkable that here comes the rabbi, right? Here comes Jesus, the prototype. And when he calls his disciples, how many of them are in the synagogue studying under a rabbi? How many of them are working in the temple? How many of them are in Bet Midrash? These are teenagers, likely. The apostles, when they were called, are most likely late teens, maybe 20s. What are they doing? We have Andrew and Simon Peter. They're fishermen, like their dad. You have James and John, fishermen with their dad, Zebedee. You have Matthew, who's a tax collector. We don't have any evidence whatsoever that any of the 12 apostles were studying Bet Midrash, which means what? It means all of them were dismissed at some point, whether that be 10 years old, they were told, go and learn the trade of your father, okay, be a fisherman. Or 15 years old, they were told, go learn the trade of your father. You didn't make the cut, go be a tax collector, go be a carpenter, go do something else. None of the 12 apostles were in Bet Midrash when Jesus found them. Every one of them had been dismissed and been told, go learn the trade of your father. And that's where Jesus found them. And that's the crazy thing. This is the difficult thing for so many of us. Because you'd think that if you're going to be one of the people that Jesus has selected to change the world, to transform the world, that he would choose the best of the best of the best. Like that would be the natural choice. And yet here is Jesus, and he chooses people who thought their life had turned out a different way. I mean, just think about this. I don't know if any of the apostles wanted to be in Bet Midrash. I don't know if any of the apostles wanted to have to be a disciple to a rabbi. But imagine that every single one of them, at one point, they would say, okay, I thought my life would be one thing, but now it's turned out to be something else. I was hoping it would be this way, but it's turned out that way. And this is just our story, right? When Jesus steps into their lives, we have no idea if they're saying, I want things to be different, or this is fine the way it is. How many times in our lives we realize, okay, life is turning out in a way that I didn't anticipate. In fact, life is turning out in a way that I don't want it to. Because we're used to this idea, the idea that life is straight lines. So that the idea of just, you go to school, then you get a major, you get a job, you get a spouse, you have kids, and just like, that's it. That's just the natural progression of life. And you raise them to be great Catholics, and they choose to be great Catholics, and it's all just this straight line. And yet we start living life and we realize that life is not a straight line, that I got to school and I don't even know if I like it here. And I have a major and I don't even know if this is something I want to do the rest of my life. I graduated and I still haven't found a job, or I desperately want to be married, but I still haven't found that person. Maybe you did find that person, but here we are now in our 3rd, 4th, 5th year of marriage, and we're still struggling with infertility. Like all these plans that I had, all these things, life has turned out differently than I thought it would. And what do I find? I find that I wish things were otherwise. That's why today, this Palm Sunday, I think is the most important lesson in Bet Midrash that any of us could ever see. Because yes, we've seen how Jesus prays, we've seen how Jesus treats people, we've seen how Jesus has tears, we've seen how Jesus does all these things. But this is maybe the most important lesson that any rabbi, in particular our prototype, the most important lesson that our prototype can give us. What do we do when life has not turned out how we want? What do we do when we face the end? What do we do when we face failure, when we face destruction? What do we do when we face a life that can devastate us? This is the secret of Jesus. This is the secret that Jesus gives us. This is the secret Jesus reveals to us today in the gospel. That our prototype reveals this. How does he face it? Jesus walks forward with voluntary and radical acceptance. This is the key. This is it. This is the secret of Jesus. And this is the secret of our prototype. And when it comes to the difficulties of life, when it comes to the blessings of life, Jesus faces them with voluntary and radical acceptance. It's voluntary, meaning it's freely chosen, and it's radical because it means he accepts them without condition. So let's look at this. I think this is remarkable. So Jesus, the fact that Jesus voluntarily accepts his cross, Jesus voluntarily accepts reality in this moment, it changes the entire story, right? Because this is something that Jesus doesn't want. He says this very clearly in the scriptures. He says at least 3 places. We hear him in the Garden of Gethsemane where, where he says, Father, let this cup pass from me. We hear even before this, he says, my soul is sorrowful even to death. In John's gospel, he says, my heart is troubled. Yet what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. It's for this hour that I came. Here's Jesus. He does not want this to happen. And this is a pain that is not, he didn't seek it out for his own sake. Yet because it's voluntary, it changes the whole story. I mean, think about this. The whole thing we just heard a second ago, that whole story would be the tale of a mere execution. Right? Jesus on the cross is an execution by the Roman government of someone who they would consider a dissident or a revolutionary. The whole story would simply be the story of an execution, except for the fact that Jesus embraced the cross voluntarily. Right? We heard in the second reading, he emptied himself and took the form of a slave. He was obedient even unto death on a cross. This is the crazy thing is Jesus willingly, he voluntarily accepted this. And now keep this in mind. This is the only thing that changed the crucifixion from a execution to a sacrifice. That's the only thing that changed it. That Jesus voluntarily accepted it. And no, keep this in mind. Acceptance is not approval. Because you and I, we will experience difficulties in life. You and I will experience the cross. You and I will experience devastation and death. Acceptance is not the same thing as approval, but it's this. It's to acknowledge at least 3 things. First, it's to acknowledge that this is not good. The first thing that acceptance does here in this case, acknowledges this is not good. That acceptance identifies the struggle. This is a battle. This is evil. In fact, what we just heard that whole story. That's the story of something evil happening to a good man. In fact, it's the evil happening to the only good person who ever walked the face of the earth. So number 1, acceptance is not approval. It first acknowledges that this is not good. And the second thing it acknowledges is it's that I don't want this. Jesus even acknowledges that, right? He doesn't cover up his mind, his heart, his feelings, his desires, and say like, well, I'm fine. That's what we do, right? Like even when we're trying to accept something, we're like, it's okay. Jesus makes it very, very clear. I don't want this. I wish it were otherwise. Jesus makes it clear. I wouldn't seek this out. So the first thing identifies this is not good. This is evil. Secondly, and I wouldn't seek this out. But the third acknowledgement as part of this acceptance is I'm going to accept, I'm going to acknowledge that this still has come to me. I don't want it, it's not good, but it's come to me. That's necessary for this voluntary acceptance because, consider the alternative. The alternative to voluntary acceptance is the decision to resist reality, which doesn't get us anywhere. In fact, there's a story that I've repeated it many times, and I'll just repeat it again because why not? Years ago, you all know the story of Hatchet, right? The story of this, I think the kid's name is David, and he's flying this little plane over the Yukon territories, and the plane crashes, and here's this 13-year-old kid, and he's in the middle of the wilderness, and there's a point in the story. I remember my sister Amy, one of my older sisters, Amy, she was reading this to her oldest son, Max, who at the time was maybe 4 or 5 years old, somewhere in there. And she's reading the story to him, and in the book, David, again, he's hundreds of miles from civilization. He's lost in the wilderness. He doesn't know where he is. He is hungry. He is cold. It's raining out. And he just starts to cry. He starts crying and crying and crying. And then the book says that he cried and he cried and he cried until he couldn't cry anymore. And then he stopped crying and he looked up and he realized he was still far from home. He was still cold. He was still hungry. He was still wet. And crying had done nothing to help him. And so my sister stopped the book and turned to her son and said, see, Max, crying does nothing. Crying is useful at all. And of course, we had this grain of salt. We had a whole homily last weekend on the usefulness of tears and the goodness of tears, how Jesus teaches us how to weep. But there's something also in there. The point is that in the midst of the cross, our temptation is to do everything we can to resist reality. In the midst of the cross, we're tempted to avoid what scares us. And of course, we do that on so many levels, right? I mean, it doesn't even have to be like the big thing. It doesn't have to be like the massive cross. It can be the small things that just come to us on a daily basis. It can be like, okay, doing the assignment, writing the paper. I'm just going to avoid that. It scares me. It troubles me. It's difficult to do, so I'm going to resist reality. I just wish it was different. Going to work. It's Monday. I hate having to go to work. I'm resisting reality. I'm trying to avoid what scares me. Picking up the person you said you would, or doing the thing you said you would. I have a child who's sick. So I find myself resisting reality and just simply wishing that it were otherwise. I have this bill to pay or that obligation. And I can ultimately end up trying to do my best to resist reality, to avoid the facts. But I think there's a reason why our rabbi, right, our prototype Jesus, said, if you want to be my disciple, remember, if you want to live Bet Midrash, what must you do? You must deny yourself. Pick up your cross daily and follow me. He says, pick up your cross daily. Pick up that thing that comes to you daily. Do that thing that scares you, but you know you have to do. Jesus essentially is saying, do not avoid it. Don't resist reality. But to be able to say, to choose to voluntarily accept this, to choose to face what you'd rather avoid, and to choose to embrace what scares you, this is the key. In fact, we know this in psychology. If someone's in therapy because they're afraid of something, they have some kind of phobia, they have some kind of terror, whether that's a fear of knives or a fear of needles, whatever the thing is. The thing a good therapist will do is not protect them from the needle, won't get all knives away, all blades away. What they'll do is this thing that's called exposure therapy, right? So you'll gradually introduce a person to the thing that they're afraid of. So you might simply say, I've heard psychologists talk about this and say, I won't even show them a needle, I won't even show them a blade. I might just say, in my desk, in the drawer, it's locked, but there's a needle in here. And just like that slow progression, now I'm going to show you a picture of a needle. I'm going to show you the picture of a blade. And gradually, through safe and controlled exposure, this person, the blade still remains dangerous, right? The needle still remains dangerous. But because the person has been exposed to reality, because the person has not avoided what scares them, they become stronger. Like they become braver. And so with this realities, and only when we voluntarily accept what is and not simply wishing things were different, only in voluntarily accepting what is can we become like Jesus. Remember, Jesus voluntarily accepted his cross, and that is the only thing that transformed the cross from an execution to a sacrifice. And the same is true for you and for me. That same is the things that frighten us, they might kill us. The things that scare you, they might destroy you. But when we voluntarily accept them, we won't be victims. When we voluntarily accept the cross, our life, even if it ends in death, will become an offering. And this is that second aspect. This is the second aspect of what Jesus shows us in this Bet Midrash. A prototype shows us that he voluntarily accepts reality. He voluntarily accepts the cross, but he voluntarily and radically accepts the cross. He voluntarily and radically accepts life. So voluntarily means he freely chooses it. Radically means he accepts it without condition. He accepts it without the condition that, I'll accept this on the condition that I get what I want. I'll accept this on the condition that the pain ends. I'll accept this on the condition that I get the healing, that I get the miracle. Jesus shows us what radical acceptance looks like. The radical acceptance of the cross, even if it crushes me. Because we realize the radical acceptance of the cross is a radical acceptance of all of life. So Jesus accepts both Nazareth and peaceful home and Jerusalem, where they killed him. Jesus accepts both Palm Sunday and Good Friday. Jesus accepts both friendship and the betrayal by his good friends. And for us, we have to do the same thing. If we radically accept with the sunrise and the sunset, we radically accept the mountains and the meadows, we radically accept waterfalls and weddings. That also means we need to radically accept cancer and COVID and accidents and weakness and even our own sin. Because only when I have voluntarily and radically accepted all of life can I finally engage with all of life. And if I refuse, if I resist reality, if I resent reality, I will never fully be able to engage in reality. Only when I've voluntarily and radically accepted all of life can I engage all of life. And this is the last thing. If you do this, it may devastate you. That's just the truth. If you do this, if you voluntarily and radically accept all of life, all that comes to you as God's will, it could break you. But with Jesus, it won't be the end of you. With Jesus, it will change you. And that's the truth. That you are with Jesus. He is with you. You're not alone. That you're not abandoned. You're with the God who loves you. And that love is just as real as the pain. That love is just as real as the cross. In fact, that love is stronger than death. And when we voluntarily and radically accept all of it, the cross and the resurrection, the pain and the love, it has the ability to make us into something that we're not yet. I heard the story from Father Dave Bavanka. He's out at Franciscan University, Steubenville. He shared that he had a former student who was a nursing student. And as she was going through her rotations and going through her care of patients, there was a moment where one of her senior nurses was just observing her as she was going from patient to patient, room to room. And she said, "There's something different about you." She said, "The way that you treat your patients there's a level of kindness, there's a level of compassion, there's a level of care that I don't often see in people." And she asked her, she said, "Why isn't it there? Like, what made you like this?" And the young nurse thought, and she said, "Actually, I think for two reasons." She said, "One, I have suffered greatly in my life. And two, I have been loved greatly in my life." That's what enables us to voluntarily and radically accept the cross. That's what it is to say that once we voluntarily and radically accept reality, once we voluntarily and radically accept God's will, once we voluntarily and radically accept the cross of Jesus, that yes, it can overwhelm us, it will not overcome us. Yes, it can actually break us, but it won't crush us. That it could devastate us, but it will not be the end. Because we're not alone. And just like Jesus, just like our rabbi, just like our prototype, this is the most important lesson any of us could ever possibly learn. That in the face of a life that I did not want, a life that I did not choose, situations that I wish were otherwise, like Jesus, we can say, "Yet, Father, not my will be done, but your will be done." And we can voluntarily and radically accept whatever comes our way.